gathering. It's been a great conference so far. Just wonderful to hear all these great presentations. And we're about to begin our next section, which will be a psychology panel. So wonderful set of talks on some of the cutting edge psychological aspects of boredom that are being explored. Should I begin now, or do we think everyone's gathered? All right, sounds good. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to the next portion of our conference, the psychology panel. We have 4 speakers lined up for this portion. And my understanding is that each speaker will speak for around 20 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes for questions. At the 25-minute mark, if they're still speaking, I may put my hand up just to give them a signal to let them know that we're starting to run down on time. And we'll save our questions for the end of each presentation. So at the end of the presentation, we'll invite you to put up your hand and ask a question orally or put a question in the chat. Okay, so our first speaker for the psychology panel is Sumana Shri. Sumana is a PhD student at Claremont Graduate University in the USA. Sumana's talk is entitled Boredom Experiences During the COVID-19 Lockdown. So Sumana, I'll invite you to share your screen and give us your presentation.
Hi, thank you so much. Let me just get a little oriented here. Okay, perfect. Well, hi everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Sumana, and I am a PhD student in the Positive Developmental Psychology program at Claremont Graduate University. And I am really thrilled to be here at the 5th International Conference of Boredom. And when I first started studying boredom during my master's program back in 2014, nobody around me really knew or heard anything about boredom as a research topic. And even though we know that many scholars have written about it. And so here we are now with a conference specially dedicated to boredom. So I thank you all for really instituting this community of practice just dedicated to boredom studies. So the focus of my presentation today is to explore how people cope with daily boredom. And I will be presenting insights from the experiences of daily boredom during the COVID-19 pandemic. So over the years, we have asked many questions related to boredom, such as, what is the definition of boredom? What really is boredom? Trying to explore the concept and how do we measure it? Is it dispositional? Is it state? What really happens when people are feeling bored? What is the kind of experiential, emotional, and motivational states that people experience when bored? And then we've also looked at, why do people feel bored? What are some of the common causes and factors that accentuate feelings of boredom? And we've also looked at, what happens when people feel bored? What are the consequences? And in what context do people frequently feel bored? Academic, work, leisure, or, when they're alone versus with other people, and variations of that. And the most common question that a lot of people really want to know the answer to, especially in the general public, is really about how do we respond to boredom? What do we do when we're bored? And how do we cope with it? But the research on boredom coping has been pretty limited in boredom research so far. And there has been some literature that has looked at, for instance, What are some of the maladaptive ways in responding to boredom? And typically this is in the form of, engaging in risky behaviors or substance use or procrastinating. And there's been a lot of research that is focused on specifically the maladaptive ways in which people cope. But recently, people have also started to look at what are some of the adaptive ways of responding. And some researchers believe that boredom is in fact actually a signal which tells us that it's time for us to seek out something more meaningful or more challenging, as we just heard from Aaron Westgate's talk right now. So what this indicates is that when people respond to boredom, they can do so in both an adaptive or a maladaptive way. And so the question becomes, how then can we understand and increase the frequency with which people use more adaptive ways of responding, and which ways of responding are most efficient? Now, to answer this question, Nett and colleagues, they sought to understand and identify the different boredom coping strategies that people typically engage in. And they did that by studying the students in academic contexts, specifically a math class, and they use the stress model as the coping with stress model as a reference point, and they came up with 4 different strategies, which are divided along 2 different dimensions, which are either approach and avoidance or cognitive and behavioral. Now, approach strategies involve persisting with the boring activity or situation and moving towards problem solving, while avoidance strategies involve moving away and escaping from the situation. And cognitive strategies involve changing one's perception and manipulating their attention and thinking differently, or disengaging, while behavioral strategies involve taking actual explicit actions. So a cognitive approach strategy might be when a student goes and reminds themselves what the value of the current activity is or the value of studying math. Whereas behavioral approach would be where they go and ask the teacher for extra help or for extra work. A cognitive avoidance strategy would be when students daydream in class, and behavioral avoidance would be when students start to text or talk to other people or skip class altogether. Now, researchers have found that there is a difference in the efficiency in the effectiveness of these coping strategies, and they believe that cognitive approach strategies are the most effective, and they are associated with more positive outcomes such as better academic performance and better health outcomes and lower depressive and negative mood. And they've also found that certain people, people typically tend to use the same strategies across multiple situations, and they call them as reappraisers. And these are individuals who tend to favor cognitive approach strategies, and those who favor behavioral approach strategies are called criticizers, and those who use avoidance strategies are evaders. Now, however, these coping strategies, like I mentioned, have mainly been studied in the academic context, but we know that boredom is actually a daily experience. It's something that all adults across different walks of life engaging in different types of activities experience this. So we really need to understand then, how do people cope with their daily experiences of boredom? And research has found that, for example, Chin et al. Found that people are bored for like 40% of the time during a given week, which is quite a lot. And especially during this pandemic, the people's boredom experiences, the frequency with which they felt bored really increased. And so the pandemic offered us a really unique opportunity to study how people coped with boredom and understand a little bit more about what kinds of coping strategies do people use. So my research question that I really wanted to understand was, how do people cope with daily boredom specifically? And my specific research questions were, what are some of the boredom coping strategies that people use on a daily basis? And how do people use each of these strategies when coping with daily boredom? This is a pretty ambitious project that we've embarked upon. So I will be presenting the results for the first two research questions, while a third research question that we're still analyzing data on is also trying to understand whether the different coping strategies that people use vary based on the type of activity or situation they're engaged in, the reason for why they're bored, the intensity and frequency of their boredom experience, and individual dispositions such as boredom proneness. So this data comes from a larger study that my colleagues and I conducted, where we were capturing the daily experiences of US adults during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown. So in April 2020, we conducted a 7-day daily diary study on Amazon Mechanical Turk, where we asked participants to respond to a set of survey questions at the end of each day between 5:30 p.m. and 12:30 a.m. local time. They also completed a one-time end of study survey, and people who were above the age of 18 and were in good health during the pandemic were included in the study. And the final sample included people who had completed at least 5 days of daily diary entries. And so the final sample that resulted was 289 adults. And amongst them, there were 1,992 daily diary responses. Now, to capture the daily boredom experiences and what they did to cope with boredom, they were asked 3 open-ended questions. So first, they were asked to describe a time when they felt bored, and to tell us what they were doing and why they were bored, and what they did to stop feeling bored. We also have data on boredom intensity from using the multi-dimensional state boredom scale, and how frequently people felt bored on a daily basis. So for the data that I'm presenting today, the analysis that we did was we content analyzed people's responses to their to the question what they did to stop feeling bored. And we used Nett et al.'s 2010 boredom coping strategies as a model to start off. And we also saw if there were any new codes that emerged. My colleague and I established intercoder reliability for 15% of the data. And what this is basically the degree of agreement between multiple coders to see whether the way that we're interpreting and analyzing the data holds across different people. So the primary coding reference, like I mentioned, was Nett et al.'s boredom coping strategies. And then I created some additional subtypes that emerge from the data. Okay, so the exciting stuff. So what did we find? Well, first off, we found that 36% of people mentioned that they were bored on any given day. So boredom was, again, roughly, something that they experienced for about 40% of their time during the week, as previous literature has shown. And 80% of our participants mentioned feeling bored at least once during the study period. So the data that we'll be analyzing is from the responses that came from people who told us what they did to stop feeling bored. So that is a total of 726 responses, which is 36% of the total number of daily diary entries that we had. So the first research question that I wanted to answer was, what boredom coping strategies do people use to cope with their daily boredom? And I found that people do use all four types of coping strategies, but that they predominantly use behavioral strategies, especially behavioral avoidance strategies. I also found that there were some new interesting subtypes that appeared within these behavioral strategies, which I'll be going into when talking about each of these strategies. So the second question was, how do people use each of these strategies when coping with daily boredom? So what do these strategies look like? We know what it looks like in academic context, but what do they look like when people are using them on a daily basis? So cognitive approach strategies, which are basically, what people do in order to persist with a boring activity by either changing their perception or attention. This is what these are the different ways in which people used this strategy. So first, I found that most of the time people just said that they just used their sheer grit and persistence, that they just kept at it and they eventually got in the groove or just worked through it. And they didn't really mention using any kind of specific cognitive approach strategy for most of the time. Excuse me. And typically this was probably because, they weren't either actively aware of how they got themselves to persist, or they weren't really engaging in that kind of metacognitive thinking of, what exactly they were doing. Now, the second way in which people used coping cognitive approach strategies was they refocused on their goal, either by reminding themselves what the goal even was, or by trying to find some new goals to pursue, or changing the way that they were approaching it. So one, they said, I tried to focus on what I needed to do, or they try to focus on the value of why they were doing this. So like one person said, I try to focus on how making dinner for my family was an act of caring. A third way in which people used cognitive approach strategies was to manage their quality of attention. So where they either try to be fully present in the situation, or by trying to take their mind off of the fact that they were being bored. And a fourth way was either by managing their emotions, where they either increased their positive emotional experience, like trying to stay positive and have fun and enjoy the experience, or by reducing and managing the negative experience that they were having, such as, just trying to shake off the negativity. A fifth way was by focusing on the finish line. A lot of participants said that they kept telling themselves that they just want to get through this so that they can be done with it, and that they can move on to other things much faster. So, or that they could, avoid having to think about doing this at a later time. And lastly, they use the cognitive approach strategy by just accepting. They just accepted the situation and made peace with the fact that they were bored and they didn't let it get them down. Or a person said, well, sometimes you just got to suffer. You just have to persist with it. So what we see from the data is that when using cognitive approach strategies to cope with daily boredom, people persist by focusing on the goal and its value, and they try to improve the quality of their attentional and emotional experiences or make peace with feeling bored. Now, coming to the second strategy, which is behavioral approach strategy, which involves basically persisting with the activity by taking explicit actions. So the way that people use this strategy on a daily basis was, one, they either recalibrated their goal by creating a more specific goal with the activity or looking for additional goals to pursue. So, for example, a person who was bored and had been driving decided to make a video of their trip. Or a nurse who started to, when their work started to slow down, they just got up and started looking if they could help someone else. A second way was they modified how they executed this activity by either increasing the challenging, the level of challenge, such as, usually they did this by trying to speed up how fastly they were doing it, or, try to finish as quickly as possible, or by reducing the challenge level by asking for help or just doing the bare minimum. A third way that they did this was to change some of the peripheral conditions of their work, such as, adding some sort of stimulation or trying to change the vibe. So, putting on some music so that it kind of helps them focus a little more, kind of, like doodling. And a really interesting subtype that emerged that I want to highlight is that a lot of people talked about taking a brief break. And now, in previous literature, taking a break from an activity would typically be looked at as a avoidance strategy because people are stepping away from the specific activity. And especially in the context of, say, academic boredom, students are in a much more physically constrained environment, and so taking a break from the activity may not be possible, and it may look like really drastic ways of coping, such as skipping class or not showing up or leaving. So, but in the case of daily boredom, it actually really helped people to just get up, take a stretch break, walk around, get a snack, get some coffee, and then come back. And that really helped them focus. So perhaps sometimes just really kind of taking that little break might be more effective. So when it comes to using behavioral approach strategies to cope with daily boredom, people either modify the goal of their activity or how they're performing that activity or the peripheral conditions of the environment, or they choose to take small breaks. So up until now, we've talked about how people use approach strategies to persist with the boredom activity or situation. So now we turn our focus to avoidance strategies, where people moved away or tried to escape from the boring situation. So the first type of avoidance strategy is cognitive avoidance, where people mentally disengage from the activity. Now, this was the least observed coping strategy. There were only 3 instances when people expressed using this, where they either think of something else or they tune out what was happening around them. So they said, I daydreamed about fantasies, or they just tuned out from a meeting. The reason why the people probably did not use cognitive avoidance strategies was because they did not actively recall using them, or that these strategies are more commonly used when people are in a constrained situation. So like when students are in class, they are daydreaming because they can't physically leave the situation. And now, as we'll see, behavioral avoidance strategies were the most commonly used type of strategies to cope with daily boredom, mainly because there's probably a lot more flexibility in, for people to leave a situation. And also, these were adults that we were studying. So even if they are in a situation where they're working, they still do have greater autonomy to leave that, or it is more socially acceptable to leave the situation or the activity. So for behavioral avoidance activities, what we observed was that people either switch the activity to start doing something new and different, or they ended the activity completely and left the situation, or they said that they walked away or they took a break. Now, taking a break in a behavioral avoidance strategy is different from taking a break in behavioral approach, because in this situation, we observed that people didn't make any explicit mention of whether they came back to the activity. While in behavioral approach, they explicitly said they only took a brief break and they immediately went back to it. So when people walk away from an activity, or they, or start doing something different, what do they do instead? What kind of activities do they typically engage in? So the most common type of activity that they engaged in was actually trying to manage their physical stimulation, or how they were feeling, how they were feeling physically in that immediate situation, and trying to probably seek some sort of immediate relief. So this looked like, this included things like exercising, going for a run, going for a walk, or eating and cooking, getting a snack, getting some stimulants like coffee or alcohol, or taking a nap, or taking a shower. And this was then followed by media use, which I found surprising, because typically the go-to activity for a lot of people when we think of how to cope with boredom is to just pull out our phones and start scrolling and browsing the internet or go on social media. So in our data, using social media or watching TV or watching YouTube videos and TikTok videos was actually the second most common activity that people began doing. And what was really interesting was also that people also engaged in, very frequently engaged in productive work or active leisure. So they engaged in productive work like starting a new house project, like doing yard work or something that they've been putting off for a while. Or they engaged in active leisure activities like reading, listening to music, or gaming. And of course, they also really like to socialize, either with their friends, family, or with their pets when they're bored.
Sumana, so
Yeah.
sorry to intrude. We're getting tight on time.
Okay,
So maybe if you could just take one more minute and draw
sure.
your presentation to a conclusion, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you. So when it comes to behavioral avoidance strategies, people switch to doing something else that's either distracting or calming, or actively re-engages them with another activity. Now, there are two unique daily situations that came about that I want to draw our attention to, and we'll perhaps not go into too much detail, but it's really important that we recognize this, because this isn't something that shows up when we're studying boredom as a specific, activity-specific experience. So during the day, we're not really engaged in a specific activity every single minute. There are a lot of times when we're doing nothing, probably because we don't have anything to do, or we can't decide what to do, or we're transitioning, we're transitioning from one activity to another, or we're just waiting around. We spend a lot of time waiting in lines, waiting for someone to show up, waiting for someone to call. So I also explored how people coped with boredom during these two specific situations that are unique to daily coping. And for waiting, people typically just go on social media, or they just try to do something that's immediately distracting. And when they have nothing to do, it was surprising that a majority of people actually began new projects. And this was perhaps also a COVID effect, because people had to learn new ways in which they had to re-engage with their time that they had left over. So some closing thoughts is that behavioral strategies, especially behavioral avoidance, are the most commonly used to cope with daily boredom. And coping with boredom in daily life is really different from coping with boredom in an academic or specific context. And what I really want to call out is that we shouldn't be quick to dismiss avoidance strategies, because they might be effective in certain situations where in academic context, we know that avoidance strategies are typically associated with poorer outcomes. But when looking at it from a daily experience of boredom context, the effectiveness might be coming in terms of providing immediate relief, or it might be an opportunity to pursue new and more meaningful activities, like how scholars have identified that boredom is actually a signal for us to seek out something more meaningful. And in the academic context, the assumption is that the original activity that people are participating is more valuable, but in daily context, that may not be so. So we shouldn't be quick to dismiss the effectiveness and adaptiveness of avoidance strategies. So these are some things that future research can explore. And with that, I would like to conclude by quoting my research advisor's favorite quote, which is that, our lives are typically filled with a lot of boredom, and it's really up to us to learn how to improve the quality of our life by turning this adversity into an enjoyable challenge, into an enjoyable experience. And that's why learning how to cope with boredom and effectively use it can greatly improve the quality of our daily life. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sumana.